Well, I think now we're going to move on to repertoire choices for black. Actual recommendations which I'm going to make for you against each of the white fourth moves. And the first move we're going to consider is bishop d2, which clearly will be, I think, the most popular choice for white. I reckon this happens in 60 to 65% of all Bogo Indian games. And it's the most economical choice for white. He doesn't have to put his knight on a passive square. He doesn't put it on c3 where he allows black to double the pawns immediately. Instead he just settles for the modest move bishop d2 and hopes to work up some sort of slight edge due to his control of the centre. And now, as we've seen from the introduction, black has various moves: queen e7, a5, bishop takes d2. But the first variation we're going to look at is the line where black plays c5. I've mentioned earlier that I thought actually the Bogo Indian could be played by black with a minimum of theory. Well, I think this is true of c5 as well. I've always had a liking for this variation. Black attacks the centre straight away. He's not worried at all about bishop takes b4. He inherits double pawns on the queen side, yes, but the pawn on b4 is awkward for white, as it prevents the knight from coming out to its best square on c3. As I say, this is a line which can be played with a minimum of theoretical knowledge. You just have to understand how to fashion the pawn structure to your design out of the opening and then place your pieces accordingly. And to illustrate this, my first game comes from the Vikings A group tournament, the Tata Steel tournament, played in 2013. And it's an excellent example of what black can achieve when he plays this system. It's a game between the Dutch Grandmaster Erwin Lamy, 2627, and the Chinese Grandmaster Wang Hao, 2752. So after c takes b4, Lamy settled for g3, as many players will do. They know this is the prescribed recipe in the Bogo Indian. White just fianchettos on the king side and gets castled. But this doesn't interrupt black's opening plan, who basically is trying to effect a dark square strategy. d6, nice modest move, taking control of the centre. Upcoming, queen to either c7 or queen to e7 according to circumstances, and then a well-timed e5. If white ever hits the pawn on b4, then black can defend it quite easily with either a5, with moves like knight c6, and maybe even with knight a6. Note also that if white forces through the move e4, there's once again a significant danger of this bishop on g2 becoming a bad piece. White's got to really watch out in the Bogo Indian that this piece doesn't become bad. So white castles, and now black plays a5. So just a continuation of the same plan, dark squared control. Perhaps Wang is considering the move knight a6 in this position, queen e7 and then e5, and then at this point white's got to make a decision. If white's pawn from d4 is eliminated, then a black knight on a6 can conveniently slip into c5, and we saw an introductory game where this idea proved almost decisive. So white played a3. In this situation black could take, but he doesn't have to now, as knight a6 looks like a coherent move. One of the nice things about this system I like from black's perspective is that it's quite easy to find good squares for his pieces. And now black has a choice really about where he puts his queen. In our featured game, black played queen to c7. I suppose the only argument against that would be white putting a rook on c1, which actually he does in the game. Lamy just plays a very natural move with the rook. If you don't like that, then queen e7 and then e5 seems like another very solid way. I mean, I personally prefer that to our featured game. There was a game between a person I can't pronounce, I think he's Polish, and Weichhold, played in Germany in 2012, where white went queen e2, black played b6, white went rook fc1, black went rook e8, queen e3, and only now black should play queen c7. And white's not really better in this position. Black's got everything under control, and once again I think there's a significant danger this bishop on g2 could run out of prospects in the middle game. So that would be a satisfactory situation for black. Well, going back to our featured game, Wang decides to play queen c7. As advertised, rook c1 was played. He'd had this position before in a game from China in 2010. There white played queen c2, black played rook e8, and in that game black just completed the development of his pieces, and once white had played e3, then he goes e5. There we are, a nice coherent position out of the opening for black, and full equality, I think. The game Zhu Weiqi versus Wang Hao went on d takes e5, knight g5. Note that white has not blocked in the bishop on g2. Nevertheless, the black knight finds a nice square on c5. White took, he played bishop d5, rook f8, queen b1, bishop g4, f3, bishop h5, and after knight de4, knight f takes e4, the position was balanced. Let's go back to queen c7. Okay, well, rook c1 was played. We can't argue with that. And now rook d8 by black. Slightly unusual placement of the rook. I think black's still leading up to e5 though, and at that point it's quite useful for him that the rook is on the same file as the white queen. Let's drop back. Now, surprisingly, b6 is also playable. I've showed two short draws in the notes. Doesn't tell us very much, other than this is also a very solid choice. I don't think this this is quite as good as rook d8 from a winning point of view, because it allows white to exchange pieces. For instance, white could go knight e1 here and then chop on b7, chop on b4, and then just go knight c2. If you're quite happy with the draw with black, no problem here. That was the game Nanu versus Berescu, Romania 2010. But in our featured game, black played rook d8. Okay, knight e1 was played, and black played e5. Knight comes to d3, black brings his bishop out to f5. And in its own way, this is quite an instructive move, because black is giving white a free hit on the bishop with e4. He likes that because he's shut down the bishop on g2, and after bishop g4, f3, another probing move by black, the bishop drops back to d7, having done its work, forcing weaknesses by white, or at least committal moves, in the centre. Now, just to drop back to the move bishop g4, I mentioned queen c2 in the notes, but after that, I think e takes d4, a takes b4, and now bishop e2 is good. The point being that black can take on d3, and then play queen b6, which is a little bit awkward for white to meet, as he now has to cede the dark squares on the queen side. And when he takes, we have the nice trick knight b4, and then queen takes a5, with, I think, a better game for black. Black's dark square control is quite important in this position. Very thematic representation of what black is aiming for. So going back to our featured game, you'll recall that black has probed white's position with bishop g4, forcing f3. Now it's a question of where to go from here. White sees the chance to try to downgrade black's pawns on the queen side, takes twice on b4, and then plays the queen out to b3. Black's got it all under control, queen b6, and now Lamy plays c5, which is definitely the best move, but it creates a very difficult situation, where in the follow-up, actually, Lamy goes wrong. Black's got to take that pawn. White gets his knight to a good square, not d takes c5 in this position, when queen a5 is good, and if queen e3, we go queen a2. White's queen side's very vulnerable here. Instead, knight c4, queen comes to a7, and white takes on e5, and black plays knight e8. So now what we actually have here is a transformed pawn structure. Basically, white's got to find some way of getting this pawn roller going. If he doesn't get that 5-3 pawn majority in the centre and on the king side going, then black is just going to roll the queen side. I mean, one easy plan for black is just to put the bishop on e6 and go b5 and then try to get c4 in. My impression is this position is slightly easier to play for black than white. White's first task is to get rid of his awkwardly placed pieces on the queen side. So the queen moves to a nice central square, and if bishop e6, the knight is out of the pin. So after this, black gets the pawns moving straight away. Knight d2. Well, I think this is the moment where white should have played knight to d6. I think that's got to be the best move in this situation, opening up fire against the pawn on c5. Black really doesn't want to take that knight, recorrecting the white pawn structure. So what he's probably got to do is to play c4, forcing the queens off the board. But I think white would certainly be in the game after f4. Something like king f8, rook f2, king e7, knight f5, check takes. Okay, this position is very unclear. Certainly white should have played it. White's opened up his bishop. Not that easy for white to get those pawns rolling. As you can see, they look nice, but they're not going anywhere. Black's got this nice pawn majority on the queen side, but it's all to play for. At any rate, in the game, Lamy drops back with knight d2. There's an exchange of queens, very similar, but this time around, of course, white hasn't got this intimidating d6 knight, which black has to deal with. So it's more comfortable for black this way round, and Wang finishes very nicely here. He exchanges off the rooks. He creates a passed pawn. White takes, black takes, knight e3, and now b4. This is all self-explanatory. Black's pawn majority is much quicker than white's pawn majority, and white's still got his bad bishop, which he tries to resolve, but which doesn't work. g6. By now, the black pawns are so strong that he can even give away his knight. And the finishing moves for rook d7, bishop b1, and now this beautiful move, rook d1 check. Knight takes e1, c2. A very attractive finish. So there we are, a game from the highest level of chess, where and a good one to start off with, where white was really unable to take any sort of advantage of the black double pawns on the queen side, and from the opening obtained nothing whatsoever.